All right. Good morning, everyone. This is room 404 with the 11 a.m. session. The presentation is going to be on Texas progress and flaring 6 years emissions data from 2015 to 2016 to 2022. And here to present for us is Troy Boley with Spectrum Environmental. I'll give it over to him.
Wow, I actually got a formal introduction. How about that? That doesn't happen too often. Thanks for coming. As I understand it, there's no session after this one. You go from here to lunch, right? So I'm standing between you and a very fine gourmet meal that I'm sure will be astounding. I have been working in the flare arena for a long time. Some of you as well have been working in the flare arena. And my time goes way back to maybe 1994 when I got my first notice of violation from Texas for a flare issue we had at our little plant here in LaPorte. So I never heard of 60.18 until then. And I tried to argue around and around and around. But basically, my introduction into flaring was by way of enforcement. And flares have followed me everywhere I go. And throughout my career, I cannot escape them. So finally, you just embrace, right? Just embrace what's in front of you and go for it. And we've had a fantastic, fun run of flare-related work for a good long time, and seen literally hundreds, so many more. I think Herman and I stopped counting how many flare systems we've walked down. Maybe not as many as the John Zink guys in the back. You probably have seen a whole lot more than us, but we've definitely seen a bunch. And every now and then you want to take a little step back and say, am I making a difference? So I had this really crazy altruistic reason for doing this little review. And it's not super crazy technical. It was a little bit of me showing you my heart. I'm trying to figure out, have the last 20, 30 years been worth it? And are we making progress? And I know what I want the answer to say, but I just thought I would do this little review. Now, some of you may know the late Russ Nettles, former TCEQ, passed away 2017 or so. Very instrumental in helping to focus Texas on the flaring issue. He worked with the agency, but instrumental in the 2010 TCEQ flare test that Zink hosted at their test stand. Very instrumental in a wide variety of flare-related topics. He and I had talked years ago about changing some of the databases that TCEQ has. There's a lot of data that they put in the database, but there's also a lot of things they don't put into their databases. And so we kind of picked and chose a few things that would be really awesome to review. And if you can believe it, it's taken a little while, but I did a data request, and we did this last summer, and we acquired, the 6 years worth of flare data. And we were able to mix and blend and combine multiple databases together, and that's what I have here. And so now you know a little bit of my motivation. Basically, good job, hip hip hooray for Texas. You guys are awesome. If you follow the numbers for all pollutant classes for the entire state, all reporting emissions, all industry, Texas is down, 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 all across the board. Every single thing is emissions decreases for all reported emissions. And this is straight off the most recent website. And everyone should feel jolly good about this. This is great. The emissions are by source, though, are not in here. So this database was of little use to me. I wanted to peel the onion back a little further, as Shrek would say, right? So things are complicated, so let's peel back the onion. It does. Emission events, scheduled startup, shutdown, malfunction. It's the emissions inventory that all the sites prepare if they're required to prepare one. right? And it's fixed stationary sources only. It's not mobile sources. That's a totally different inventory. Good question. Your data is being used. You are reporting data. And in today's world, wow, the data moves fast and people are using it for both good and bad. On the right-hand side is the Department of Energy's review of venting and flaring from the upstream oil and gas sector across the country. And it does speak of Texas significantly. Of course, it's a very large contributor to flare-related emissions nationwide. But on the one hand, you may have a good news article. On the other side, you have the Earthworks review from last year, and Earthworks said, Texas, you suck. That's basically their report, and wow, people are going to use the data to come to a variety of interesting things. I guess what's fascinating to me is before it was hard to get. And now the data is becoming much, much easier to obtain. If I can get it, anybody can get it. So just a reminder, a little trip down memory lane, long series of flare activities. Most of this should be to help justify in our minds why things are getting better. Things should be much, much better. We all had NSPS, so parts A's. We had HRVOCs in Texas. I think everybody knows what that is around the Houston non-attainment area. Those are all pre-2008. We should have been in a good standing back then. But we had a lot of regulatory changes, particularly in the refinery sector. So any emissions inventory review today should account for the huge amount of work that many people in this room, this conference was built upon the flare rules way back when. So we've been presenting on JA, H2S, SO2. We've been talking about flare emissions estimates from AP 42. We've been talking about flares from the refinery sector rule, tons of instrumentation, huge cost. I mean, you could take the preamble words and kind of come up with how much it cost. But in our experience, it's usually per flare around $2 million of implementation cost just to instrument the flare. And your team internally will spend a lot more time than that helping move that capital project along. It sounds simple, a flow meter and an analyzer, but it is not simple and it's complicated and it does add up quickly. But all of these different things, flare consent decrees, a decade ago is when Marathon and BP signed their consent decree. That's a decade ago. It's hard to imagine, right? And how many more consent decrees for flaring initiatives have come along since then? Quite a few. And of course, there's more to come. So we must be really good at what we're doing because we're repeating it. We're doing more. So the expectation, bottom line, gut reaction is all these flare-related emissions must be surely decreasing. The basis for the HRVOC rule, started a lot of inquiry started back in 2000. The rule came out in 2004. There was some justification cost. How much do these analyzers cost? Flow meters in the Houston area. This is the baseline emissions inventory that justified HRVOC as a program. And the program was broken down using a special emissions inventory because these data were not routinely collected back then. And so you'll see man, that doesn't show up at all. Spectrum green. So flares are broken down by the key sectors that contribute to them. And you'll see the refinery sector, 300 some tons of refinery related flare emissions in and around the Houston non-attainment zone. And the 1,400 tons, all sectors combined. This was for 2008, the baseline year for HRVOC, 2008. And of course, Environ pulled this together. They did that under contract TCEQ. And of course, included cooling towers, other vents, fugitives. There's more stuff in the HRVOC program than just flares, but flares was the key component, I'm uniquely interested in. I just want you to have those numbers in your mind as we think through some of these things. So I did a FOIA request for Texas. Texas gave me their standard disclaimer. I just reproduced their disclaimer here for you. It does include startup shutdown emission events. It does include routine emissions, includes the ozone season. Sections of the year for 2020 weren't quite complete and validated yet. Blah, 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 blah. So most of that makes sense. What's really confusing is the way TCEQ had to give me the data. It came in a variety of files, not one. It's not a database. It's not like the government gives you the database. They give you spreadsheets of mass chaos, and they want you to try to make heads or tails out of it. The FIN data in Texas is very unique to your state. This state is bizarre. It has facility IDs, has emission point numbers. The way you choose to do your permitting for your plant may be totally different than the way your sister plant does it down the street, even though you're called the same company. And some people in Texas have an emission point number for maintenance event, right? You have a MSS permit in Texas. That's totally different than Louisiana, other states. You may have an emission point number called a flare number 1, and it gets MSS emissions and it gets routine emissions. It's the same emission point physically, right? We know that. It shows up in the database twice. Now, that doesn't mean the numbers are double counted. It just means that the MSS emissions, often more than not, show up as routine emissions because it's a routine emission from an MSS permit. If that makes any sense to you. If it doesn't, talk to me later and we'll explain why Texas does crazy things with their permitting. But making clear distinctions between upsets, emission events and other things, that's not the purpose of this. I just wanted to make sure we weren't double counting anything. So all these giant spreadsheets that came to me, a little bit of a disarray. Special call out to my son. He works in the automotive industry and he worked for us for a couple of years, but he is quite familiar with flares, imagine that. And he volunteered to convert all of these data sets into a Power BI viewing tool for me. So that was hugely helpful. So big call out to my boy. You take all the data sets. Here's the 2,262 flares in the glorious state of Texas. These are the ones that are in the TCEQ database, not to be confused with the number of flares that could be or might be in the Railroad Commission's data set. I have not done a cross-reference with them. Their data set is uniquely different. Some Railroad Commission flares are in the TCEQ, but not necessarily the other way around. And one can certainly zoom in on the Houston regional non-attainment zone. I know those dots are a little hard to see. But just as you would suspect, they kind of congregate here around the 225 corridor and around Texas City and down by the Freeport area. But lots of flares in and around the zone, if you want to call it. Big overview of the 2,000 plus flares. About 20% of them are in HRVOC service. Now, this isn't me declaring that they're in. This is the site operator who reported in their EI. The operator declared they're in the HRVOC program. 20% of the state flares are in HRVOC service. Of course, it's always fun to look at steam assist, air assist, and unassisted. Another look by SIC code. And as you would imagine, the majority of the flares are in the upstream oil and gas sector. It's only sheer coincidence that that number is 666. We'll let you all contemplate that little joke. We find out, though, just as we suspected, the refinery flares come in 72 flares in the glorious state, all associated with SIC code 2911. Those 172 flares were part of my most important review. That's because of the rules that apply to them. Those were the 172 that I was most interested in. There is some interesting stuff on the flare capacity, design capacity. This is a bad word. It's poorly worded in your permit application. This comes off of what we call Table 8. If you do a permit application in Texas and you have to describe your flare, what you're building, they want to know design capacity. And this is poorly worded in the sense that I'm not sure what they're talking about. Is it the design capacity of the pilots and the sweet gas, because it constantly refers to natural gas and fuel? Or is this the design capacity of the actual smokeless capacity? That's the concepts we use in the refinery sector or in the JA world, right? So the design capacity is off a little bit. Some of these numbers get really huge, and I really don't, and that can't, some of these numbers can't possibly be for pilot lights. So there's a huge amount of inconsistency in how people interpret this. The agency, maybe 1 year, will help figure this out. Do have a couple oddities. There's 3 flares at the meatpacking plants. I have no idea what that's about, unless they're doing some biodigester thing for burning off gas, methane or something. I have no idea. And one at a car wash. That was the other one that just threw me for a loop. So there, it just goes to prove it's a data set, and there's going to be some errors along the way, and somebody probably misplaced or displaced a number. Dyslexia strikes again, right? So. Here, flares in Texas just for the petroleum group. 172, 50% of these are in the Houston area. And to be even more precise, they're accounted for at only 14 facilities, so 14 registered entities. So these are a pretty tight group, right? Of that, if you look at the EPA data set on flare management plans that they have available for public, 124 flares in Texas are in the flare management plan. That's a federal program. So there's probably some flares that uniquely got replaced, removed, dropped out, consolidated, maybe got switched out with a combustor, a enclosed combustor rather than a flare at a rack, who knows what, wastewater. What's really fascinating though is now 75 flares in the refinery group have flare gas recovery systems. So what do you think their flare volumes, flare amounts might be? Should be pretty close to 0 if that's how a flare gas recovery system is supposed to work, except for upsets and whatever. And of course, just for comparison, the 510 or so flares nationwide. That's kind of interesting. Again, this is leading me into the pathway of our emissions must be going way down on flares, right? I'm leading you along, aren't I? You can tell. So what would you predict? JA, more flare gas recovery systems were put in because of JA in particular. I would expect SO2 numbers to go down in the inventory. NOx, some of you may be involved with your emissions inventory at your plant. And for NOx, there's a little bit of debate over how to do that emission factor. It's a pound of NOx per MMBTU. So it's not a pound per volume of gas to the flare. It's pounds of emissions per heat value, heat content you're sending through. And there was a little back and forth up and down on what that value should be based on. And in the end, it's based on the gross heating value of the gas, not the net heating value of the gas. So just a little heads up there. You would expect then, after 2018, NOx numbers to go up. We're basing it on the gross heating value, right? That's what you would expect. VOC emissions, well, heavens, I was hugely optimistic that all these minimizations, these rules require minimization assessments, right? We've all been doing a bunch of these, line by line, point by point, component by component reviews, talking about why we use it, how we use it, what that number is. And especially HRVOC. If anything, they already had the instruments, they already had all this stuff. Very little flare-related work was performed by us in and around Houston because we heard over and over and over and over that we already have flow meters, we already have an analyzer, our systems are good, all we need is to control our steam valve for RSR, we're done. So everybody was quite bragging on how Houston was far along the curve and we didn't need to focus our marketing on that. And of course, in 2020, you can't help but think the last year of this whole data set that we're going to look at, 2020 has probably got nosedive to it just based on COVID. Probably not related to actual emission decreases, probably related to COVID and other situations. So let's take a look at these. We'll go through them one by one kind of quick. All flares statewide, only flares. So this is not the total emissions inventory for SO2. This only flares statewide. What is that? 14 or so tons in 2019. 14,000 tons, all sectors. What would you guess is the refinery contribution to SO2 compared to the upstream oil and gas? I mean, I think your gut reaction is going to be what? The upstream sector is the hugest part of this, right? More than likely, the upstream group is going to be pushing out more SO2 than the refinery. And that's exactly. So here's the refinery group, same 6 years. Their number is quite low. Now, there's a little regulatory trend that could be discerned. And that is, remember, JA came out in 2012. The applicable date for JA was 2015. And we all know that some refineries weren't quite ready for that target date. And they got some extensions, right, for JA. And some of them said, there's no way I can meet this limit. I have to capitulate. I have to put in a flare gas recovery system. So we had quite a few compressors go in, 15 through 17. And you won't see that impact until a couple years later. And that kind of matches up with a typical capital cycle. By the time you buy a compressor, put the compressor in, you get a little bit of reduction. So that's all good. But I would imagine that these numbers are all based on the actual analytical and the actual flow meter. So this is probably the best data set we've ever had in Texas for flare SO2 from refineries. And I think the impact is at 1,000 tons a year compared to the whatever 14,000 tons per year, 2 to 1. Not a huge source. So if you want to go chase SO2, it's probably not of the refinery sector that you need to beat up on next. It's probably another. So that's kind of the quick overview of the SO2 number. I didn't go peeling back the onion too deeply. I'm trying to keep this high level. One could certainly do a review of these last remaining routine emissions back here and figure out who are these remaining companies and see how they compare to each other and their peers. My purpose here is not to pick on any particular company. I'm going to try to keep it high. If that's okay. The data set is by flare and is by company. Here, let's take a look at NOx. NOx all statewide. Definitely had an issue with the AP42 factor in 2015 is when the revised AP42 came out. And then they clarified and updated it and said, no, we were sorry for making anybody guess. We were wrong. In 2018, it clearly states gross heating value of the gas is how you calculate NOx. And so is there a run-up in 2019 due to that? Possibly. I really don't know. I don't have, as you know, the inventory doesn't include, like the TRI, it doesn't include a production factor, production weighting to know how companies are producing hero. And remember the NOx factor is now still 0.68 pounds per million BTU, not based on volume, but heating value. And yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Maybe not as dramatic as you would think, but interesting in that the number's going up, not down. Right? Generically, the trend is up. And maybe that's for a variety of reasons, right? You can probably imagine why. We're adding supplemental gas to our flares, right? We're adding more BTUs. So everybody argued, why am I doing a rule to minimize emissions and I'm adding gas and I'm making more emissions? There may be some element of truth to that. The NOx number would suggest that would be true, right? Here's the refinery sector, which is definitely a bit of an upward trend. This giant yellow block here, that's the emissions event at the Baytown refinery. You have no idea why that is 322 tons associated with a singular event. I don't know what that was. I don't know if that's a power blip. I don't know if that's somebody forgot a decimal point and maybe it should have only been 3.22 tons. I have no idea, but that just is a wild outlier. Um, but basically, NOx in the petroleum sector, this should be based on really good data, right? It should be based on the calorimeter, the BTU count, and the flow meter count. Available now is unprecedented statewide, so these numbers should be quite good. Trended up. Coming next, in the AP 42 calculation, we have a choice, and this is where Texas gets really confusing, and they're not helping the matter. The VOC emission factor is 10 times NOx, right? So VOC emission factor is 0.66, not 0.06, right? So you would imagine in your brain that VOC, which is about to come next, the VOC number is probably 10 times NOx. And some states do it that way. But Texas in their EI gives you a choice. And this is where I can't read people's minds, so I don't know what the data is really telling me. They give you the choice of applying. If you sustained net heating value above a certain number, 300 BTU per SCF, you get to claim what for your VOC destruction? 98%. Texas goes farther. They say for some compounds, the C1, C2, C3s, they'll give you 99%. And in fact, in the latest emissions inventory for this year, during last year, it's even a little bit of a sliding scale for VOC. So now instead of applying emissions factor to the VOC number, now Texas is giving kind of these choices. And what I see are a lot of people doing the 99, 98% DRE. They take that VOC number and just chunk it away. So it's a little hard to make a clear comparison but if that were the case, that's another step down the path of the VOC number is probably going to be getting smaller because Texas is allowing us to use clearly in writing the 98, 99 sliding scale for VOC DRE. So VOCs, all flares statewide. You would imagine that this is how it should have been. Texas, part of the fracking revolution, right? So heavens to Betsy, we've added a lot more flares, a lot more activity, especially in this 2019. This is pre-COVID. I mean, that ought not to be a big surprise. And these are flares outside of the Houston non-attainment, right? So one can imagine that a ginormous part of this big number is the oil and gas boom. I thought what was fascinating is the growing magnitude of the emissions events. So instead of the routine green flare, the green number, the magnitude of these yellows these are the special, unique, one-off emission events. That number needs some more research to figure out what's going on with that. And again, are these unique 1, 2, 3 individual companies that may have had a unique event similar to the Exxon one for NOx? But look at the HRVOC number. All VOCs in HRVOC attributable only to flares. Way back at the beginning of this talk, I showed you a slide on the 2008 baseline. What was that number? Remember? Test, quiz. I'm going to show it to you. Yeah, so here we are, 2,400, almost 2,500 tons of flare emissions, HRVOC, which of course is a subset of VOC, right? HRVOC is only 12 VOCs of the total VOC. Here it is for petroleum, and we have a unique number. This 2000 number, remember on the HRVOC baseline, we had like 300 tons of HRVOC attributed to the 14 refinery sites in and around Houston. And now it's nearly 500 tons larger. There's a line, all industry, I mean, all HRVOC. Group compared to 308. Something's going on. right? This is not the good news story I was hoping to share. This is remarkable in that the data is not necessarily showing that flares in particular are going in the right direction. Maybe, and now we get to theorize. Why, how come, what's going on? One would have thought the numbers, especially for HRVOC, should not have changed as much because historically they already had flow meters and analyzers, right? All we were doing was adjusting steam control. So over the last decade, or nearly two, that's the last decade at least, we've doubled our flare-related emissions in Houston. These just 12 compounds. This is going to get someone's attention, maybe your plant's attention. So whatever you put in your emissions inventory, you may want to take a peek. Then again, just a reminder of where those numbers. That was the TCEQ's baseline year 2008. So observations, some takeaways, some thoughts. Buoy, shame on me for waiting 6 years to figure this little trend out. I was happily, gleefully, joyfully skipping along, thinking that y'all were doing great work. We are doing great work, and that the numbers are going to be fantabulous. This turned out to me to be a pretty big Debbie Downer overall, and I'm still reeling in my head as to how we doubled HRVOC in and around Houston during this time period. One idea might be maybe we added more flares. Right? These are people at plants saying, I am now subject to HRVOC. Maybe they didn't know that back in 2008. Did HRVOC program expand since that time? Maybe, maybe not. Some things to investigate further. The data sets are very complex. They did not hand them to you in a neat, nice, tidy, workable order. I have found some duplicates, not nearly enough to account for doubling of the flare emissions, but there are some oddities in there. For 2020, saw a lot of reductions. That has to be a production related value. The upstream oil and gas sector definitely took a nosedive. Definitely some COVID, a lot of weather issues, right? Texas, the Houston Gulf Coast had some hurricanes, had some shutdowns, had more shutdowns than normal. You would have thought that would have showed up in the MSS emissions or in the emission event. Definitely, there are some still large emitters, individual, company-wide, of SO2. Maybe they don't know that they're still large, or maybe the last of the remaining large emitters of SO2. Maybe they should take a peek at that before another NGO or somebody else does. Because you can't help but think, how do they maintain such a high SO2 number and not have flare gas recovery? And some interesting dynamics that just don't add up quite right. For NOx, maybe this is AP42 effect, the calculating gross heating. Yes, ma'am.
That the change of the heating value of nitrogen or hydrogen in single RSR could have impacted.
It could, because the 1212 versus 294, when the NOx factor says use gross heating value, they never clarified, am I allowed to use the turbo boost on hydrogen for that emissions factor or not? So some companies may be using gross heating value of the mixture, but considering hydrogen at 294. If they consider hydrogen at 1212 and they use that as their gross, you're right. Not there's a super boost on top of the super boost, right? You see the additive effect of having a high BTU for hydrogen, and some sites may be doing that, not knowing that it's affecting their NOx number year over year. It'll make a big impact though when you want to do a reduction or contemporaneous period for permitting, right? Or your potential to emit, or comparing it to your permit allowable. Definitely going to make a difference. Another observation is the VOC I was definitely altruistically, I honest to God thought minimization studies, the detailed pouring over of drawing after drawing, talking, literally for a decade. Surely the VOC numbers had to have been minimized. And this just really threw me for a loop. So I am thinking that more research needs to go into this, and maybe even by company, and understand possibly what happened, how it happened. Is it a calculation issue, or is it really the instrumentation? You know something now because you've measured it, and we didn't used to measure it as attunely as we used to, even though HRVOC's flow meters have been in since 2004. A very interesting dynamic. Definitely the HRVOC issue is probably worthy of, I got a feeling, Dr. Allen from University of Houston, a lot of people are going to be interested in what's going on, how and why, and by whom. So this is definitely going to get somebody's attention. Keeping clear the FIN, EPN versus routine versus EE, all of those things in the emissions inventory could definitely use some better clarity from the agency on where to put things, how to take away some options from people on how they report their emissions. And the bottom line is I barely scratched the surface on this ginormous data set, and there's a lot more to do. And even more after we get 2021's EI that y'all are preparing right now. I think they're due, or they're probably already mailed in, right? They're due March 31st or something. So there'll be a fun new additional set to add into this one. Hopefully by the middle of summer, the agency will have that available for me. So that's basically it. And we're going to double down and keep doing what we're doing, right? Because that's the way the rules are written. So more instruments, more rules, more flow meters, more analyzers. We're going to keep doing it for more industry. And if you haven't blocked out your Friday morning yet, Herman in the back here is going to give a 4-hour complex, detailed review of the entire chemical sector, all these different rules that apply to different flares. If you haven't sat through the detailed regulatory discussions, 4 hours of flares, it'll be exciting. You don't want to miss it. It'll be great. All right. Any questions? Did I stun you all? Did I shock you all? Did I depress you? I'm sorry.